Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new Clapmore Languages webinar. We're very happy to have you with us today. And that being said, it is my pleasure to officially welcome you to this webinar called Bridging the Gap, Combined German Courses and Exam Readiness. I will now give space for our amazing presenters to introduce themselves.
Hi there, my name is Tyler William Johnson. I'm one of your world language sales consultants at Clet World Languages, and I'm excited to be with you all at yet another webinar hosted by Clet World Languages. Just so that you know a little bit about me, if you've not yet met me before, I am one of our non-native fluent speakers of German, and I like to say this because, as we'll see in just a second, I've actually taken some of the exams that we're going to be talking about today. I've also been a student of some of these combined courses, and I've also had to either teach or help prepare for these combined courses as well. So I have a little bit of, so to speak, experience, as my colleague will talk about in just a minute about this. I am currently residing in our Chicago area instead of, where I did my undergrad and bachelor's at. I did teach German for over 8 years, and just some fun little facts about me is I did live in Germany for a bit. I have taken the DSD2. I've helped students prepare, and I know this isn't German related, but je apprends le français as well. So it's really exciting. And now my colleague Molly.
Thank you, Tyler. Tyler and I sort of switched places because he lives in the Midwest, where I'm from, and now I'm in the South. I'm based in Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm also a non-native fluent speaker of German. I've both studied in Germany and in Austria, earned my BA and MA in German. I have over 10 years of experience teaching all levels of German, everything from elementary to college, everything from elementary to advanced speakers, children as well as adults. I was also the executive director of the German American Partnership Program at the Goethe Institute in New York for 4.5 years, which was also a very wonderful experience. And yeah, that's me. So let's get into it.
Yeah, so a few of the things that we're going to see today, of course, we just did a small little introduction so that you can know both Molly and I a little better. We will do a quick little question. So I know we did say just a second ago, hold off the chat function, but we are going to ask you to do a little bit in the chat function in just a second. So we'll ask you a couple of questions, then we'll look into these exams that we're preparing for. We'll talk about the idea of the North American perspective, especially when looking at these combined courses. We'll talk, of course, during these perspectives, the exams about skill training, but then we'll go a little bit more in detail about the skill training with reading, listening, writing, and speaking. I will then talk a bit about technology, especially when we're looking at combined classes and using technology as an example within the classroom, and of course, a quick conclusion as well. So one of our first questions, and again, you can answer these in chat. We'll give you about 45 seconds to answer these. But the first one is just in which setting do you teach? So for instance, are you at a language school? Do you teach at a Saturday school, immersion school? Is it a mixture of both? For instance, when I taught, I was higher ed and public and language school. So, you can always be a lot of mixes there. But yeah, if you could please, like I said, 30, 45 seconds, and we will go from there. So it looks like we have a lot of public teachers in here, a lot of public high school and middle school. We have a few private schools, higher ed. That's really interesting to hear. I actually took my DSD in higher ed. So more public and private schools. Awesome. Give it about another 15 seconds.
I do see a language school in there as well, Tyler.
Yes. So, yeah, Molly and I were unsure if we were going to get a lot of language school teachers here or more of a K-12 environment here or not. So, um, yeah, awesome. And nice to, I guess, virtually meet you, Leoba. I know you and I have chatted in the past. So, yeah. So now let's go to the next question. So our next question is, are combined classes a commonality in your setting or in your settings? So for instance, when I taught higher ed, I typically had to combine my threes and fours together. in my when I was doing proficiency-based language school courses, I would have students who were in just A1, but they could be completely beginner A1, as some of them were also maybe more advanced A1 students. Oh, wow, and that having students from ages to 3 to 90, I've been in your scenario before. I've been in your shoes. Okay, so we have a few that had 3 4s. We have a couple that not now, but they have been. We have a couple combined upper levels, but sometimes out of necessity. Awesome. No, this was really great to read through this. And then let's go to that last question real quick. And then for our last question, for which exams are your students preparing? So we'll talk about a few of these exams in just a few minutes. So are you preparing your students for the AP exam? Are they taking any type of German international exam, such as the Deutsche Sprachdiplom, UST, and ACTFL exam? So it looks like we have a lot of APs. Actually, STAMP is new to me. I don't think I've heard of this one before.
Okay, I gave the stamp as a teacher in North Carolina, so I can speak to that as well.
Oh, I definitely know the Regents exam. And university placement tests, DSD-INS. This is great. And we're going to talk a little bit of some of the examples for these and also how we can make sure that you are successful for these. But if you still want to, chat in the, put a couple things in the chat, we're going to keep moving on, but feel free to, keep letting us know what you teach, how do you teach it, and etc. So now, I said here, let's analyze just to make sure that we can read through all these, but it is really neat to hear how we are all in similar environments, but also have, of course, different environments as well. Even if you're K-12, private, higher ed, we're preparing our students for some type of proficiency. And what does this proficiency mean? In what ways can we train our students through the proficiencies? But not just that, if we have to have these combined courses, what does this mean whenever we talk about proficiency for someone who's maybe in that A1, A2 Spanish, or excuse me, German, but also is trying to take this course with someone who might be already branching into the B1 German as well? So, as we go into our next slide, Molly will speak to us briefly about the North American perspective, and then we'll look into some of the exams.
Thank you, Tyler. So I'm going to talk a little bit about high school classrooms versus German Saturday schools. I know some of us teach at public high schools, some of us teach at German Saturday schools, some of us teach at both. Um, but I wanted to go ahead and speak to that. So let's look at some of the key differences just for understanding so that we're all on the same page. So when we're looking at US high schools, learning German at a US high school, oftentimes we have students that have had limited exposure to the language. They may have never learned a foreign language before. They're not being exposed to the language at home generally. Um, their motivation is often to get a good grade so that it looks good on a college application, or perhaps it's a requirement in your state, and so they have to take a foreign language, world language, and so they choose to take German. Um, the curriculum, depending upon the district you're in, can be a little bit more flexible, and you'll see what I mean when I compare that to Saturday schools. In terms of time and frequency, you're seeing your students often, whether that's every single day or a few times per week for 45 minutes at a time. You're often talking to your students each and every day, or you're exposing them to German a few times a week. This is definitely different than German Saturday schools. German Saturday schools meet on 36, I believe 36 Saturdays throughout the year. That is a much more immersive environment, but you are limited to those 2 or 3 to 4 hours where you are with the students. Maybe you have a couple of hours and then a break, but you are not meeting for more than a few hours in general. What you find at Saturday schools is they often have very mixed levels. So while you may have mixed levels at the high school, in terms of Saturday schools, oftentimes you'll have heritage speakers mixed in with speakers that are learning German as a second language or Deutsch als Fremdsprache. And so they might have very different needs in terms of, and very different capabilities in German. And we'll talk about that in a minute. In terms of motivation, it of course varies as students are all very different, but it tends to be a more intrinsic motivation on the part of the students because maybe their parents are German or their grandparents are German. They want to, they go to Germany every summer or Austria or Switzerland and want to communicate with their relatives. So their motivation is that level of communication, that level of proficiency that allows them to go to Germany and communicate with their relatives. Um, there's also that motivation, oftentimes, especially for the parents, to have their children just given the opportunity to have their child study in Germany, given the lack of cost, they are it being close to free of charge. They oftentimes want their children to study in Germany. And so that's also a motivation for them as well to do well so that they are able to study in Germany because you do have to pass a German proficiency exam. Oftentimes the DS-2. Oftentimes the curriculum is very standardized because we have these German schools. I believe it's about 40 some German schools throughout the US, German Saturday schools rather. And it's very standard in terms of curriculum. It's discussed with the German government and set together with the German government. So it's very regulated. Whereas if I'm teaching German in North Carolina, it might look different than if I'm teaching German in Missouri, for example. So it varies at a US high school, whereas German speaking Saturday schools tend to be a little bit more unified in their curriculum. With that said, there are advantages and disadvantages to both situations in terms of once a week classes. On Saturdays, you obviously have a lot of family commitments on Saturdays that you kind of have to balance, and so students may not be making it every Saturday. And as if a student misses one day at the high school and they miss German for 45 minutes, it's a little bit different than if they miss, one of their Saturday school classes and have missed 2, 3 hours. So that can be a challenge as well, especially when you're working with students that might need more assistance than others. So let's take a look. Um, I'm going to hand this over to Tyler so he can talk a little bit about the different North American based exams.
Yeah, no, thank you. And these are the exams that I was at the beginning most familiar with, especially preparing students for these and being just a learner of the language myself. The actual OPI, we do know that this is mainly used in higher ed scenarios, especially making sure that you have these proficiency interviews. And with these, we want to make sure that students are receiving all the materials that they can in order to score the level that they may want. When we start looking at these exams, we do have to keep in mind that these are going to be at the ACTFL standards. So when we do look at the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, we do need to keep in mind that these will start from the novice low going up into this advanced level. And then whenever we start looking at this even further with OPIs to talk about the other exams that we may have, we want to make sure that our um, excuse me. We also want to make sure that we can look at the idea of the ACTFL with the Apple as well, as I do know that many schools may be looking at this, but as we may assume, the two different exams do require students to do different portions on each of the exam. So if we're looking at the OPI, we're going to be doing more of our proficiency when it comes to the interview base, whereas with our Apple, we're going to be doing a little bit more when it comes to reading, listening, and writing. And then we know that with the AP language and culture exam, as I say that many of you are preparing your students for, within this exam, students are really having to make sure that they are honing in the four different skills, especially when looking at the idea of reading and listening, writing and speaking, to make sure that they are able to achieve all four of them in order to receive all of those points to pass this exam. So we have a few different perspectives here that we can look at, and not just that. Some of the examples that we'll show you later within our textbooks will also show that you have all the AP materials aligned starting on day one, meaning that if students only take German 1 and 2, they're already getting this AP IB dual language exposure because of how our materials are set up. So it's not like one of those you're waiting until level 4, level 5 to train all of your students at one time for one exam, but rather these perspectives have been trained throughout all the different levels of our materials, and we'll show examples on how this can be done as well. In the next slide, we'll look a little bit about how these exams will help students and what exactly the students are achieving with these exams. So, one of the biggest things that we talk about with these exams that we just had on the previous screen is the idea that students are able to apply, therefore, for the syllabi literacy. And I know at a lot of K 12, especially public K 12 districts, this is super important. One of the districts I was actually at today told me they had 26 students recently receive the syllabi literacy, which I think is a really great thing to hear that this is still happening throughout the country. But one way for them to be successful in the syllabi literacy is either to pass one of these exams that we spoke about earlier, or to even go into these 4 different skills to show that they are a fluent speaker, a fluent writer, a fluent listener, as well as a fluent reader. So we want to make sure that students are really able to progress through each of the skills effectively while also having the different skill sets in order to be successful. And then I know Molly in the next slide will briefly go over some of the international exams that she and I have both actually taken ourselves, just 2 different ones in perspective.
Thank you, Tyler. Yes, he and I are both quite familiar with these exams. From my perspective, I have given the Deutsche Sprachdiplom, both the first and the second, as a high school teacher of German at a public high school. And then I've also given the Deutsches Sprachdiplom one at a Saturday school. I myself have taken the Österreichische Sprachdiplom level B2, and then I've taken the Goethe C1 proficiency exam. So I am very familiar with these exams. So with that said, let's go right into it with the Deutsche Sprachdiplom. The great thing about the Deutsche Sprachdiplom is that we do have exams leading up to it that you can give at earlier levels of proficiency. So the Deutsche Sprachdiplom is basically a tool for the students to be able to study in Germany, to prove their German proficiency and study in Germany once they've passed level 2. Now, it has all of the vier Fertigkeiten. It has listening, reading, writing, and speaking that is tested. Um, and it can be quite daunting if a student hasn't been exposed to it in the past, which is why we also have something called a Vergleichsarbeit. A Vergleichsarbeit is available for level A1 and for level A2. You can give this. I've given it at Actually, I gave it at an elementary school, the Vergleichsarbeit, and I've also given it at a German Saturday school. But the Vergleichsarbeit is the same structure, but at the A1 level, and the same structure at the A2 level. So the great thing about that is that the students have then twice been exposed to the format before moving on to the Deutsche Sprachdiplom. So when we're talking about the listening, reading, writing, and speaking, what we have for the speaking is basically a short presentation with the Deutsche Sprachdiplom where the student is talking about a specific topic that they've researched. And so in preparing for the Vergleichsarbeit, so these sort of lower level proficiency exams, they also pick a topic that they speak about. So it's going to be an A1 or A2 topic. So for example, to to talk about, what my students were talking about when they did the A2, they talked to me about their families, or they talked to me about travel, or they talked to me about what they like to do after school, or they talked to me about their favorite film. So things like that. Whereas once you get to the Deutsche Sprachdiplom 1 or 2, you're going to be talking about higher level things. I know a student just did a presentation for the DSD 1, for example, about tennis, and this is how you play tennis, and they explained it. Or somebody talked about German film, the history of German film. Another talked about a specific type of German art that interested them. So it does get to a higher level, but the nice thing is already at the A1, A2 level, you can assess, where are my students in terms of proficiency? Where do they need to, where do they need to be, and how do I, push them in between to get to where they need to be? So those Vergleichsarbeit are very helpful. And also towards the end of the presentation, I will have those links for you so that you are able to take a look. But essentially, it's a building block, and then you have the Deutsche Sprachdiplom 1 and then the Deutsche Sprachdiplom 2. And by the end, you're proving C1 proficiency, and you should be able to study in Germany with that. Similarly, we have the Österreichische Sprachdiplom and the Goethe A1 to C2. The difference between the Österreichische Sprachdiplom and the Goethe A1 and C2 is that the Österreichische Sprachdiplom has listening activities, has writing activities, has activities that will have some more Austrian vocabulary. So a little bit different in terms of the vocabulary, but there we all have students that have lived and perhaps worked in Austria, and then in that case, they may wish to take that exam, and that is available to take in the US. There are various places throughout the country that offer it. Goethe A1 to C2 obviously can be taken at the various Goethe institutes throughout the United States and abroad. And the difference would be that the Goethe Institute is the cultural institute of the Federal Republic of Germany. And so then the language is going to be more German based from Germany. So that would be the big difference between those two, but still an Österreichisches Sprachdiplom at the level of A1 shows A1 proficiency. Same thing with Goethe. It shows that A1 proficiency. And in terms of the difference between all three, when we're looking at the Deutsche Sprachdiplom, the Österreichische Sprachdiplom, and the Goethe A1 to C2, it tends to come down to both personal preference and availability in terms of what each individual school offers, but they all three are really a great way to assess proficiency for students, to assess proficiency for adults wishing to go to Germany as well. I know Tyler himself took the Deutsche Sprachdiplom. Tyler, what was your experience with the Deutsche Sprachdiplom in terms of, what you experienced?
Yeah, no. For me, it was a lot. It was a lot more preparation than I was expecting because it's one of those that you learn the language for so long, and then you're like, oh yeah, I can speak the language. I've written essays in my German courses, and I've done these presentations, and then you go to do it and it feels completely different. And I know, like Molly was saying a few minutes ago with her students, one talked about tennis, the other talked about film. With a Deutsche Sprachdiplom, the level 2, they don't really give you the topic until you get there, and you're given about 20 minutes to study it, and you have to present. And that was a little different. So for us, it was I think my topic, I forget what my topic was about, but it was very deep, and we had to really use those critical thinking skills, use those creativity skills, and use all those skills that we had been building up to for so many years so that we were actually hitting that fluent level of German speaking, namely the level 2 of the DSD. So it is a really, I believe that this was a really great exam for myself to take, and also the co-students I took with it, and hearing from other schools as well. This has been a very popular one, especially like Molly said, for those that are wanting to go study in Germany. And when I took this myself, I didn't know, am I going to study in Germany if I'm going to stay in America? But it's really great just to know I have, that piece of paper telling me that I have studied German enough that now I'm, a good speaker in it. But there's lots of great exams that we can talk about here, especially the ones that we just talked about. But it really depends on like our essential question. What's the motivation? What is the motivation for the student? If the student isn't wanting to study in Germany, maybe we don't want to look at the international exams. Maybe we want to look at one of the more popular in-house exams or USA exams. Whereas if the student is wanting to study abroad, maybe we do want to look at pushing them towards one of these international exams. And if you're teaching at a Saturday school and at a K-12 environment, this could be a great way for you then to bridge that gap between your high school and your Saturday school programs.
Thank you for that perspective, Tyler. I appreciate that because it brings me to my last distinction. I just want to make sure it's understood. The Deutsche Sprachdiplom 1, so the level 1 is a B1 exam in which they have chosen their topic to present on. There's the reading, writing, and listening, and then there's this speaking for which they have prepared and for which they present and then answer questions about. Whereas Tyler, he has experience with the Deutsche Sprachdiplom level 2, which is a situation where you are given the topic, you have 20 minutes to come up with a presentation that's a little bit different, and it's more B2 C1 level. So that is a really important distinction. But as you can see with the Vergleichsarbeiten, so when you've got the basic A1, A2 exams, and then you've got the Deutsche Sprachdiplom 1, where you're have the presentation prepared in advance versus the Deutsche Sprachdiplom 2. So that's a distinction there as well. And in terms of the Österreichische Sprachdiplom and the Goethe A1 to C2, that's something, that also allows you to study at a university and show your proficiency. It just depends on the needs of you and your students and what's available to you. So let's talk a little bit about strategies for high school. So best practices for preparing high school students for the AP German exam. Because most often when we are in high schools, we are offering the AP German exam. Not to say that every student will go from German 1 all the way to AP, but we do want to basically start preparing them for the AP in level 1, which I'm sure um, most of us do. So you want to practice all four skills regularly, and we'll get into more of tips and tricks and things that we can do. But we want the listening, reading, writing, and speaking incorporated in each unit, modeling based on AP style tasks. With that said, speaking about AP style tasks, that kind of brings me to my point about introducing formal letter writing early. Even, and now I'm sure it's more extreme, but even when I taught AP, about 10 years ago, there was the issue of letter writing and students not being familiar with letter writing. Um, it's very much, as we know, SMS text-based world. And so my students didn't really know the structure of a letter. They didn't know that you write the date at the top and then you write dear so and so, and then you have the body, and then you have the conclusion and your name at the end. And so first, we talked a little bit about that just in general, and then we worked on this is what it looks like in German. And we wrote, pardon me, from German 1 on. Obviously, it gets, a little more complicated in terms of sentence structure and what have you as you go up in the levels of proficiency. But from the get-go, my students were reading about as well as writing short emails, short letters, so that they really understood that format. Because as we know, as AP teachers, that's a huge part of the AP exam, and that is a part that students tend to struggle with. But if they've been practicing that again and again, it becomes second nature to them, that when they have to write that formal letter on that AP exam, that they know exactly how to do it, that they know how to say sehr geehrte Frau blah blah blah, sehr geehrter Herr blah blah blah, for example. So that's really important. In terms of culture, you obviously want to integrate culture consistently, and that can be done in a variety of ways, as we know. One of those ways would be to have a textbook that really embeds culture in everything that it does, and we can show you a few examples later in the webinar. Other times, with the internet, we can, pull up authentic resources kind of at the click of a button in terms of posters or in terms of, authentic communication or videos, things of that nature. So that it makes things a little bit easier than it might have been in the past, which is great. Using authentic materials for students to interpret is also incredibly important in terms of infographics. Infographics are also a big thing on that AP exam. So we want students to be able to look at and interpret infographics. Again, I start from German 1. Students are exposed to these infographics. They have to answer questions about them. And it may be that it's a really simple infographic. If it's a more difficult one to interpret and it's a lower level class, then I might be asking, more detailed questions with um, multiple choice answers, for example, so you can kind of scaffold it that way. Another great thing that I was talking about with the DSD exam, is that, there are different exams associated with the DSD that you can offer every year. Um, so it's important to have these types of proficiency exams that you can give students to assess them. So I know one teacher in the chat had mentioned that they give the stamp test. I know that's was required of me when I was a teacher, and that in that case, giving that to the students every year prior to the AP exam really helped me see in which areas they were improving, where they needed more help, where I needed to go back and kind of reflect. So that was really important. There's also, for example, the AATG German exam. I know Saturday schools that administer it. I'm aware of high schools that administer it as well. And that's another great thing that's very aligned to actual standards that allows you to assess student learning as well. And are they getting to the level they need to get to reach the AP? Not only that, but the students are then much more familiar with the test taking, the proficiency tests for German. So that kind of eases the anxiety a bit for some of our students, which is incredibly helpful. And then another great thing to do when teaching German and knowing that you're offering AP is to use AP rubrics for feedback. And we do have, those links for you at the end of the presentation so that you're able to see them. But that's extremely helpful. So they see why they're getting a certain score because it's very detailed and written out for you. And that allows the student to see where they are and how they can improve, and it makes it very familiar to them versus just kind of in AP starting with the AP rubrics. Then the students only have the year to learn all of the material, perhaps, and then also familiarize themselves with the rubrics, which can be quite difficult to do in 1 year. So we kind of the main goal would be students get to the AP year and we're really able to sort of fine tune what they don't already know and really kind of get to deeper into the topics versus having to teach them about the formats that maybe we could have hopefully have taught them in earlier levels. So we're going to talk a little bit about the resources from CLET. So the great thing about our resources that we have for teachers, whether it's our textbooks, our readers, things of that nature, are kind of they all follow a certain format. And one of the great resources within our textbooks is definitely the interpersonal written communication rubric, the various rubrics that we do offer. And I think it allows for teachers as well as the students to see where they are in terms of proficiency. It's very extensive in that it has, a bunch of different criteria that you can really see what you need as a student to focus on. We're focusing on obviously it being comprehensible, it being understandable, and that perhaps there are going to be errors, but that they don't affect the full understanding of, for example, the written text, that they're using appropriate vocabulary for their level. So it kind of allows them when they look at it to see, okay, this is what I need to focus on more. And then also for the instructor, for the teacher, okay, this is what my students need to work on. So it's great that we have, for each textbook that we have so many different resources and they're really well organized, which is another great thing about our resources. So they're kind of easy to utilize because you know where they are. So that's also another great thing about our resources, for example. Oops, let me go back. There we go. So let's look at another resource from a book called Klasse, Test Training. Tyler, have you used Klasse before? I think you're pretty familiar with the test training as well.
Yeah, so with the test training, one thing that's really great with the Classa series, especially starting in the A2 level, is that starting, I believe in chapter 4, if I'm not mistaken, they start training or giving these test trainings for students so that they're able to so they're able to really start understanding how a test will be set up. And not just that, as we'll see in an example later, is that these are also some of the examples that are taken directly from either the DSD or DSD-2. And what's great about this is that then you as a teacher are seeing true examples from these exams, but not just that, students are already being trained in the second level of the series so that they're able to really understand how these exams will be set up. And it's not just hey, we're doing a preparation class in order to be successful. I remember that was always one of the things for my students, also helping other teachers prepare for these was a lot of the students felt like they were training for this test that they should have been training for years before. And it was out of nowhere. They're like, I'm having to do all this right now. I don't understand. Whereas what's great about things that we offer, and also as Molly and I have both done as teachers ourselves, is that we want to start these trainings starting in level one so that if you have that student go all the way up to that level, none of this is new. I used to kind of joke and say that, I taught Avid with German as my emphasis because I was teaching these students these 21st century skills that they would be learning inside of either AP, IB, or any other scenario. So, yes, I was teaching German, but they were learning these skills that they need to also use in other courses, but we're doing it, of course, in those target languages. So that's a good example from a classe here. And if we go to the next one, believe, yeah. And this is from Das Porter team. Now, Molly, I'll let you speak a bit about this.
Sure, absolutely. And I just wanted to add, in terms of the fact that the test training is embedded within class, I'll actually go back and then I'll continue. But one of the great things about that is really that the students are familiar already at the A2 level, of what those tests are going to look like. So it's not a surprise. Versus in the past, I personally, as a teacher, had, you know, when I first started, would have students not necessarily practice these types of skills, and they weren't necessarily in the textbook I was working with. And that led to a lot of right before the exam teaching them how to take the specific test, which was for me quite frustrating, and I'm sure for the students as well. So this is just another way that CLET resources sort of give you the tools that you need to help your students develop their proficiency and succeed on these exams, which I think is great. This is a resource from Das Reporter team. So Das Reporter team is part of our reporter series, which we also have in French and Spanish. And you can see that this is a self and peer assessment for individual work. And this allows the student to kind of rate themselves on how they feel they are doing in these different areas. And I think that is a great way for students to see where they are in terms of proficiency. It's low stress because they're the one assessing it. It kind of allows them to take charge of their own learning, which is what we want, and allows them to really have a list of this is what I should know in this chapter. So you can see it's based on chapter. It says Kapitel 3, chapter 3. And so as you're looking at it, these are the certain verbs they need to know. They need to be able to do various things. What's their preparation look like, their communication, and it may lead to, giving something like this sort of peer assessment, self and peer assessment for individual work before perhaps an exam helps them see where do I struggle? Where do I need more help? And allows the instructor to look at it too and see where does my student need more help. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about strategies for Saturday schools. Obviously, there are similarities and differences to middle and high schools that we had talked about. I would definitely say that in terms of Saturday schools, we see a high level of understanding. So their listening comprehension is usually quite strong. Um, Sometimes the reading proficiency, especially among heritage speakers, can be quite strong as well. But the speaking and writing proficiency seem to be most difficult. Speaking for non-native speakers of German can be quite difficult, as well as the writing. The heritage speakers usually have an easier time with speaking, but they struggle with the writing portion. So we want to focus our instruction on productive skills like writing and speaking. Students are less likely to get that practice outside of class, especially if they are a non-native speaker. They're not going to be speaking at home. But regardless of whether they are a non-native speaker or a native speaker or heritage speaker of German, they're most likely not writing in German at home. So that would be a great thing to emphasize in the classroom. And if you're giving homework, to kind of give little writing assignments. You want to use exam aligned practice activities, and we'll talk about that by showing you kind of more of our resources and what they have to offer. We've already gone over that we want to mirror the structure of the proficiency exams with the very focused tasks so that the writing, listening, and speaking is very intuitive and they kind of understand this is what the format is going to look like. So we want to build exam strategies into weekly lessons so that the students are understanding, the summarizing, the cultural comparison, that they're able to interpret that visual data, which is similar to what I was talking about for high school teachers preparing their students for the AP exam, that we want them to be able to interpret that visual data, to look at those infographics and interpret them so that the students are internalizing those exam techniques over time. So depending upon which exam I'm preparing my students for, and it's dependent upon which type of institution I've been at. But then I've tried to expose my students to parts of that exam throughout my time with them so that they see the format, because each exam is a little bit different. It tests the same 4 items, the listening, reading, writing, and speaking, but sometimes in a different way. Differentiation at Saturday schools can be quite challenging because of, as I said, we've got a lot of heritage speakers and sometimes, students that have just come over from Germany, so native speakers, and with students that have learned German only at Saturday school. So that can be quite challenging. I tend to offer tiered assignments to both beginners and advanced heritage speakers so that they're both challenged and engaged. They might be reading the same book, but doing a different project with it or answering different questions about the text. My students that are learning German as a foreign language also might receive questions that have, multiple choice answers. So they're both dealing with a complex text and are both learning and progressing, but they're being challenged at the proper level. I definitely recommend tracking progress with those so-called Vergleichsarbeiten that I talked about. So those are the DSD, the precursors rather, to the DSD-1 and the DSD-2. Those are the Vergleichsarbeiten A1 and A2, and we have links to those as well. Another thing I recommend for Saturday schools especially is to involve parents with practice resources. Oftentimes parents will approach me and say, my child really needs practice with X, Y, or Z. Is there anything that you have that he or she might be able to do at home? And in that case, I try to provide them with resources. Um, I'm not providing them with practice exams or anything given to me by the German government or things of that nature. But what I am doing is providing them links to various websites, or if we're working with a digital text, I'm providing them a link to the digital text that provides extra practice, which is something that our textbooks tend to have, is a lot of extra resources and extra practice that you can give to meet the needs of kind of all students, which is fabulous. In terms of resources from CLET, Tyler, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, so here's another example of where we are actually pulling this from the DSD. So this is coming from a true exam. And not just that, the students are going to have a listening activity with this. They're also looking at the idea of I just blanked on the word of this, a foreign exchange program with this. And not just that, they're working on a robot project together for this youth youth research event. And with this, the students are supposed to write 1 to 5 sentences. They also only have a minute time to do this. And then after that, they're supposed to make sure that they have understood all this by answering true or false. So there's lots of great ways for students to be successful for this one activity, in that they're doing an interview, they're having to read, they're having to listen, and then they're having to answer, meaning that we're also cycling through all modes of communication while doing these exam prep activities as well. And as we see here, a small little tip or tip or strategy that we have so that students can also be a little more successful, and know that there is no panic with these, but rather just use the language that you know, right? Yeah. So, and then from here, Some of our other resources that we'll look into some examples of here in a few minutes is that, of course, we'll talk about our main series, Klasse. Yes, this is part of the Classa series, which is really exciting. It's part of the testing series, which is available on our platform, the KWL Hub. And Classa is likely going to be our most popular series, especially for our international Saturday schools, our international series, our international schools. If I were still teaching a school, I'd probably be teaching with Classa right now. So it's one of those books that is really great for this international setting. However, one new series that we have coming out this year, which will be more for your APIB prep alignment, would be our Das Reporterteam series, which is going to be more aligned for our American market instead of that international market. So when you're looking at Klasse, again, that's more international, whereas Das Reporterteam will be our more US North American based market.
And it's important to note that Das Reporter Team aligns with our reporter series, Reporter Francophone and Reporteros, which is available, Reporter Francophone for French, Reporteros for Spanish, so that if you have then adopt just reporter team, you're all in alignment when you're planning together, which is fantastic.
Mhm.
So I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about Klasse and then kind of move on to Just Reporter Team because I know we've talked a lot about sort of our international titles and the preparation for the DSD Eins, but I also want to talk about our Just Reporter Team because it's new, it's exciting as well. But you can just kind of see what the activities look like in Klasse. This is just to give you a bit of an idea of what it looks like. For example, we're seeing a home in Germany, and then it's labeled, and then you have activities related to that. So it's very much aligned with the level that the students should be at, whether it's A1, A2, B1. And then you see the grammar pop-ups as you need them. That's a theme throughout all of our books, that you really have these grammar pop-ups that reinforce what you're learning in that moment. So the student sees something and they're utilizing it right away, allowing them to build their proficiency, but also build their confidence because what they need is right in front of them, which is always extremely helpful as well. I'm going to go into Das Reporter Team because that is our new series that we're all also very excited about as well. Well, we said Klasse is great and can be utilized in middle and high schools as well as Saturday schools. We also have Das Reporter Team, which aligns with our Reporter series. And basically, the concept of the Reporter series is that students, so young people from those particular countries, so for example, in this case, Germany, take you through different parts of Germany. There's a reporter in each city teaches you about that city. So in this case, we are learning about Berlin, for example, and we have this young gentleman from Germany who is also you know, a Turkish German, I believe. And this situation is talking about the traditional Döner. If you've been to Germany and you've had a Döner, you know how delicious it is. And in this case, the students are exposed to typical street food in Berlin, and they get to meet this reporter, this young man who takes them throughout the chapter. They learn about Berlin, they learn about Emil, and they're able to do activities and learn about him as well as Berlin. So in each chapter, there's a video where the student introduces themselves and then they talk about their city. Another nice thing about this series, it's a reporters series, so they create a magazine and you have different magazine articles that you're reading. So this one, for example, is from our reporter that we just talked about from Berlin, talking about how he loves his city. Through the use of various images and the use of, you can see the numbers there while they'll give you a translation for those particular words. It really supports the students, even in level one, to really be reading a text in German, which is exciting and kind of a win for those students. And they're learning about the history of the city as well as the young reporter. So the nice thing about this series, as with all of our series, culture is very much embedded in the entirety of the book. So it's not a situation of I need to stop and teach about the history of Berlin. It's embedded into the chapter. Everything, es hängt alles zusammen. So everything is related to everything else. And you learn about the history and the language and the culture all together, which is really a nice package deal. You can see the various mini projects that are offered throughout the book. In this one, this is about family, but we phrase it as my favorite people, and it's talking about the important people in your life. So these types of projects were really well thought out, and that they invite students to really um, they offer projects that students can really relate to. So in this case, not just my family, but my important people, recognizing the fact that maybe a coach is can also be like a father or mother figure, or that a good friend is almost like family. So it kind of allows for the students to really express themselves in a way that motivates them. So we're going to talk a little bit about skill building and technology. I will hand it over to Tyler for that.
Yeah, so we are going to go through a couple more perspectives here in our last few minutes that we have together to make sure that with these skill buildings that you are also taking this into consideration, especially with our combined courses, but not just that, how we understand that these are challenges. Know that you may have a smaller program and this is why you need these combined courses. I know while reading through some of the chat earlier, I saw that some of you had the need for it for many years, whereas now that need is not there as much, which makes me think that hopefully you have higher numbers in level 4 and 5 now. But not just that, what do we do whenever we have these different proficiency levels? Because just because every student is in level 5 German doesn't mean that they're all at the same proficiency either. So, yes, we could talk about that, these that we have this as well. We also want to make sure that that we are scaffolding for growth and proficiency. One of the examples I just saw Molly post I thought was really great, because even though the text maybe was a little higher than what the student currently is at, they are at least given this vocabulary so they can scaffold from it. But not just that, it's not about teaching new grammar that is in that text, but rather making sure that students understand what is being spoken about. So as long as it's being understood, we can use phrases like it was, even though we maybe haven't gone over this yet. Also, making sure that students are preparing for the correct exam and we're focusing on our main skills, such as what we see here. Then, as we progress on into our next couple of slides, we're going to really bring this into perspective with our reading, listening, writing, and speaking, but not just that, looking at this with the idea of aligning tasks for our different exams, making sure that students have their different types of strategies, such as skimming, scanning, and predicting, but also scaffolding in these authentic texts so that students are really able to be supported, even if they are a higher reader than other students. So, like Molly has already alluded to, maybe giving them a few extra questions, maybe bringing in some heritage perspective with it, but also differentiating for those students that might not be able to quite interpret all these texts either. Yeah, so an example that we have here from our AP Aligned series, Specta Junior, is that we have an authentic text here for our competitions for students, and within this competitions, our students will read about what this means. So this youth being built up, then what are we doing with this? Why is this important? And what is this European competition? And not just that, making sure that students also will have these before, during, and after reading activities so that they are able to be successful and scaffold through these as well. But not just that, if we had students that weren't quite at this level, and I'll show some examples from ChatGPT if we have time towards the end, where you can also turn the same text into something a little more palatable for those students that aren't at the same proficiency level as those students that are able to understand this on at the beginning. When we start talking about writing, we want to make sure that students are, of course, writing correctly and not making that many mistakes. But the biggest part that we want them to focus on, especially in these lower level proficiency exams, is that they're comprehending what was said and what was asked to them, and they're also using analyzing skills. So we want to make sure that we're giving our students some type of sentence frames and paragraph scaffolds, as we'll see examples of in a few minutes. As Molly alluded to in our Das Reportertum series, where we have the support of peer feedback across proficiency levels so that students are able to give each other feedback, be able to assess where they currently are in their own acquisition, but then for you as a teacher to be able to have these rubrics so that you don't have to always write them. We also want to make sure that we're practicing exam specific writing formats. One of the first lessons I did in every single level of my German courses was let's write an email together off Deutsch, because I cannot tell you how many emails I received with no subject from a Gmail saying, "Hey, prof,
That's
I have
funny,
a
Tyler.
question." So let's practice this, because eventually you're going to have to write a more in detail email. But not just that, if you're preparing for some type of language proficiency exam, we know that these emails are going to have lots of information in it. They're going to have questions in it. They're going to have ways for you to answer to it, as well as it's going to be more than just sending a postcard to your Oma or sending, some type of small little treat to a friend, but rather sending a more in detail email. And of course, we want cohesion over fluent or over perfection, as none of us speak language perfect. And what does perfect language even mean? Yeah, so if we keep going on, we can just look at a couple examples that we have here. Here's one of our examples of a email chat, or how I guess you would just call it a chat that we have, where then they're supposed to discuss some things for and after, such as these trends that we have in the group. And then not just that, we are then to read the different sentences and the different parts of speech so that we're able to start picking up more of our argumentative connections, so that instead of having to go through just learn a list of them, we're seeing them in real life action. And then, as we see here in our newer series, Context, which is the sister series to Aspecta, we do have here, as we see that there's a discussion, we're bringing in, 21st century perspective. So we're in a Zoom call, such as we are here. The students are also supposed to answer questions from this. And then from there, we're even learning even more of these parts of speech, or these ways of speech, so that students are really understanding how they can start inserting arguments, how they can start inserting if they agree, if they disagree, but not just that, making sure that they understand some of the commands or questions you may be asking people, as we see here as well. Of course, speaking was always the easiest to me for some reason. I know this isn't the same for all students. I don't really care to make mistakes. It's just always been my mindset. But we want to make sure that the language is being brought to life for the students. So they're given some type of asynchronous tool to practice as well, but they're also given feedback. I know we could talk a plethora about all the different AI tools that are out there that are correcting students, and who knows if they're correct or not, but they're out there. We also have lots of role playing activity. I know one thing, keep in mind, I did teach a lot online, but I would put my two students together and then make them record themselves having a conversation about whatever topic I gave them. So if we're talking about we're in the bakery, we're going to the dentist, whatever it may be, they have to record themselves. And yes, they may write it down, but they're still practicing that language so it will become more fluent, spontaneous, as well as making sure that they can differentiate on the different skills so that I can match it to the level that they were. And of course, feedback is always important. And one thing I wish I would have learned when I was a student was how important giving feedback to other people is, because that is a skill that I don't think a lot of people have learned as much. But yeah, and then if we keep going on, so an example from this, so you're talking about presentation, and then here for the presentation, as we see some types of different parts of speech for students to be able to really focus themselves on what they are talking about so they can write down notes, but not just that, making sure that they really understand how a presentation is done in that target language. As we continue on with an example from our context series, so this newer higher ed slash great for AP alignment for K, or I should say for junior senior year. But we have on here that this is online Kommunikation. So what this means here is we're going to really cycle through all three modes of communication. So students will identify, students will listen, students will read, and then later students will present. And as we sit on here again, we're also given these different ways of speaking so that students are not just finding phrases online, but rather they're finding their phrases that are relevant to this particular activity so that they can be successful. Of course, we want to go through listening and comprehension through engagement. So make sure, especially in these mixed courses, that we are chunking or slowing down audio to make the task more manageable. One thing my students loved when I did was whenever I would slow the audio down at the beginning of the listen, and maybe the first, second, third time it would be slower. And then later we would put it at the normal speed. And then about a week later, we would speed it up to almost double speed because they wanted to see how much can I understand if this is being spoken quicker. And I thought it was a great training exercise because they were having this chunked and slowed ways, but then it was also making these listening tasks more manageable. These were, of course, all authentic audios or different resources. So I was a really big fan of the Deutsche Welle as well as blank on the name now, but Tagesschau and 90 Sekunden or whatever it's called. So lots of great ways for us to be able to do this. Of course, we want them to learn these active listening techniques such as taking notes and aligning these to these exam practices. And I know we're running out of time here, so hopefully we'll be able to get through this. So just like some examples of this, just to see, we're given, these words are bolded for them so they're able to see this, but not just that, we're giving them the beginning of the sentence so that they're able to finish the sentence themselves. And then in the next exercise, yeah, so we can see a few more examples from here, but one thing I do, actually, Molly, if you wouldn't mind going to the next part of technology, I wouldn't mind speaking briefly about technology. But of course, these are just a few of our examples that you could always look at from our textbooks. So technology, and how can we build this in mixed classes? One great thing that I have always tried to use is multimedia resources, especially ones that your students bring up to you. Yes, you don't want to have 1,000 resources, but it's one way, to be to have your students engage. We also want to use our smart devices as much as possible, blended as well as giving lots of feedback. And feedback can always be on our platform itself. We also want to make sure that we're gamifying our classes well, especially with this new generation English. um, with this new generation, they love achievements. And I didn't really understand this quite when I was teaching, but one thing that they like to see is that they're actually progressing in their proficiency. So if you can find a way to track their achievements within these progression levels, students will really like this because it shows them that they are achieving something outside of, I can conjugate this verb. But also, not just that, it's giving more accessibility, flexibility for the students to find their own language, and it's encouraging this cultural awareness as they've been able to really practice and gamify the language. Yeah, so in the next slide, we will so this also helps with student-centered learning. So with student-centered learning, this is really great, especially when talking about these differentiated courses, because you're able to personalize more of your learning experiences. We increase engagement. This will also help with sometimes with immediate feedback, especially with those machine-graded activities inside of platforms. It really enhances collaborative learning as many students will realize that they have lots of the same interests. So let's talk about these same interests in that target language. And it also helps you find more diverse resources to help your students out. And then we briefly do need to talk about AI and language learning because there's so many great things that you can do with AI at CLET. If you are one of the users of our books, we are looking at bringing in AI tools ourselves. This is something we're talking, hours upon hours with our development team. But these are great ways, and I'll show some examples in just a minute on how you can actually use AI for conversational practice. Remember at the beginning of our presentation, I said I'm currently learning French. I use AI to help me learn my French. Another thing I'll do, and we'll see an example of this, is anytime I want to write an email in German, I tend to throw that email first in ChatGPT and say, hey, can you correct my grammar? Because I'm not a native speaker. Maybe I used the wrong das in a certain scenario. So it's a great way for the AI to give me that quick feedback without me having to email a colleague. And as we see, it's immediate feedback and extra learning in that target language, which I think is really great as well. So an example I did here for, AI in language learning is I created a project here inside of AI. And then I, as a student, went and, so to speak, wrote this project. And not just that, I asked my text to give me, or I asked ChatGPT to give me a corrected version of my text, but not just that, to give me the feedback as to why it corrected something as part of my text. So I know we don't see my original text here, but here it was where they gave me the corrected text. And down here, my feedback is where they told me all the items that I did incorrectly, so that in the future, hopefully, students will read their feedback. They will then not redo these mistakes again and again. And of course, technology and language learning, there's so many apps out there that you can find. Don't overwhelm yourself or your students with them, but find the ones that work best for your class or your classes. Authentic videos tend to be really easy to find with this, but make sure you're finding these differentiation tools to help you and your students be successful. And then online environments are always great. So if you ever have an online platform that gives you immediate feedback or quizzes, but not just that, I know I've participated and helped my students participate in virtual exchanges. These are great ways for, German students to help in Germany, but not just that, for our American students to then help those who are learning English abroad as well.
I will add to that that during my time at the Goethe Institute, I helped to develop the German American Virtual Exchange, which is also a free resource on the online as well. So virtual exchanges really motivate students to further their proficiency in the language. So we highly encourage virtual exchanges.
Yeah. And, I'm a big fan of online tools. So, of course, I can always talk about the different online tools that we have here at CLET, such as the KWL Hub. I know our international partners also use the alongo.net as one of their providers. But, I was a big YouTube user in class. I loved using YouTube as a differentiation tool and as a way to find authentic resources. As a teacher, this does take a little bit of time, but it is a great way to really help your students differentiate and also help them find their likes inside of the language as well. And then just a few examples of technology inside of the classroom as we see here. Some of these are examples of, we were given little tips via our little handy. We're also able to, make sure you're using your platform for the best of its ability. So using the search feature, the playback skills or the playback speeds, as well as making sure that the listening and videos are being played as well. And as we see here, we can always differentiate with some of these activities, or even have such as the one at the top right. So I'm sorry, your application, and then they're able to either do it and or type of scenario. Okay. And then, of course, above all, with technology in the classroom, you need to be patient with it. It is all new to us. I know Molly and I were practicing for this presentation beforehand and trying to make sure that we could change the slides in time, using two different computers. We're all in this together. And, my students were also great teachers. They taught me how to use a lot of those apps online. They taught me how to be more online familiar, but not just that, they're great ways to help you stay culturally relevant as well. Yeah.
So I've included just some helpful links to for the ZFA, the Vergleichsarbeiten, the Deutsche Sprachdiplom, the Goethe-Zertifikate, the ÖSD, and the AP German exam that can maybe help you take a look. They have oftentimes, practice exams, whether we're talking about the Goethe-Zertifikat or the USD, or the Vergleichsarbeiten or the Sprachdiplom or the AP exam. There are practice exams out there and more information, and so those links will be available to you as well.
So thank you, Tyler and Molly. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to send us an email either to Tyler, to Molly, or to marketing@cletwl.com. So, yes, thank you very much and have a nice evening.